Hello, hello. Dang, that's pretty cool. Alright, let's see. Good morning, everyone. My name is Avery, and welcome to New Frontier. A little background: I've worked in politics my entire life, and I'm here to share some news with you in a nonpartisan format. I've really analyzed the field. I write in politics, I've served in politics, and I feel like there is a niche gap for someone who presents some news to citizens every day in a nonpartisan format, the most important public policy news. I like to call this show APN, or Actual Political News, because I feel as if other politics news stations do not actually report what is newsworthy. How tall Donald Trump's children are, who slept with who, that commonly will be found in political news columns. I do not believe that is political news. I believe public policy, what's on the House floor, what's being discussed by legislators, and those in their those in their staff are working on public policy wise is the real news. So this show is going to be a daily show. My goal is to do it 7 days a week for the next 6 months. That's like my big goal right now. And I have a family that does a lot of streaming. My brother runs a podcast. He's a comedian. My wife is a streamer on Twitch. And me, I've made YouTube videos my whole life, so I thought, why not jump right into YouTube and stream a show like this? It's going to be very low-key. Welcome to my office. It has a collection of eclectic artwork. As you'll see, I'm going to try to shuffle in some new artwork on the back wall behind me so you can see the little collection I've amassed over the years. But we're going to break down the show into a few categories: local, state, federal, freedom, foreign policy, and a deep dive every day about a certain type of public policy. I like to just think we're catching up over some kombucha. I hope you brought your own. I brought some today. Brewed this myself. I got a little pineapple, black raspberry kombucha. And we're going to be catching up on some political news over some kombucha every morning for the next few months. So if you'd like to join in, I've included links to all the articles we're going to be covering today in the bio below. And of course, you can reach out if you think I am not covering a certain type of news or story. My goal is to present you news in the most nonpartisan way, and partisanship can slip through in just how you craft an agenda, what you talk about. And I don't want that to be what occurs on this show. So if you feel like some major political story that's not already being covered by news outlets is being missed here and relates to public policy, let me know and we'll figure out how to jump in and cover it. As for the deep dives, my friends have already provided me a list of things they would like me to talk about, dive deep into. We're starting with Big Pharma today, but I'm going to need a lot of ideas, so go reach out to me at avehill_ on Twitter and shoot me your idea of what type of public policy you would like me to dive into deeper. I have a background in public policy and law. Currently, I'm a public policy analyst, so this is my job. I'm sharing a little bit of what people ask for from me, but to you, for free. So let's dive right into it. So on the local news circuit, I found this to be the most interesting piece of public policy that is going around right now. Many different counties are trying what's called pay-to-move programs. Right here, Topeka and Tulsa are the big cities that are practicing this pay-to-move program, and essentially what it is they're attracting remote workers to their lower population towns in the middle of America, where they know these people have stable jobs and can participate in the economy without needing jobs in the city where they're going to live. And if they do commit through the program, you actually have to apply through the program. If you are accepted and move, you receive a lump sum of cash to move to the city. I have friends that have participated in this brand new program and have received $10,000 to move to Tulsa. So if you're a millennial working online like me, this is a great way to just get some extra cash flow for living in a unique place. Now, I would never take advantage of the program. I love where I live. My family's worked extremely hard to move to Florida, where we live, and we love it in our little beach town. But I definitely recommend checking this out if you're looking for an adventure and want to move somewhere for a few years. Tulsa is a great place to go, and that's out here in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They've already accepted 100 remote workers and have paid them $10,000 each to go out and move to Tulsa. All right, that's all on the local circuit. We're going to jump right over to states. I thought this was the most shocking piece of news for the day. It has to do with how we treat gun right activists, and Virginia's governor, Ralph Northam, recently declared a state of emergency related to gun rights protesters, those that are for who are not for new gun regulation. They're pro-gun people. So these pro-gun activists wanted to go and march on the state capitol and near where the governor and legislators are going to be making new laws that are expected in Virginia to limit gun rights. So Ralph Northam decided to declare a state of emergency and ban the possession of firearms in the area where protesters were going to protest. And now this Defending Your Right to Defend Yourself group is actually suing Virginia's governor over this matter. How far an executor can take the right to an emergency or right of an emergency and declaring states of emergency to benefit their own political agenda is something that we have not discussed yet in public policy. And as far as I'm aware, it has not been used in modern times, declaring states of emergency in order to silence voices of certain groups of political activists. So I'm excited to see where the courts fall on this issue. I'm going to be closely following the case as it goes through the court and presenting evidence to you about what attorneys are presenting as their arguments for and against this issue. Now we're moving on to federal. One of the most interesting and sort of related to big pharma issues, that's why I wanted to present it today, is the opioid crisis. Believe it or not, my family's been working with and talking to politicians about the opioid crisis literally since 2011, and not much has changed in the United States. We do have some new drugs that are assisting people who have overdosed on the drug, save their life, or temporarily sustain their life until they can receive proper medical treatment. However, there's not much policy being tested federally to actually assist those who are addicted to opioids, and much of the opioid epidemic is actually created by pharmaceutical companies. And I can say that even on a nonpartisan show because I'm presenting to you evidence of why it is manufactured. Here we have a graph put out by Andrew Kolodny, and he is the director of what organization again? I think he works at a local university. It's Heller School at Brandeis University, and he studies the opioid crisis, and he put together this graph here. And this graph presents the USA oxycodone use and Europe's use of the drugs. And you'll see that in America, after the mid-1990s, this rate skyrocketed, and now Americans use opioids at an epidemic level, 200, 300 times the use rates of Europe. In Europe, the rate is only steadily increasing, probably based on the increase in technology that allows for surgeries that would need oxycodone after the surgery. However, in America, we see a manufactured increased rate, and we're trying to figure out what caused this increase. It just so happens that a lot of stuff changed with pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical laws, pharmaceutical companies right around here that could have caused this increase. And of course, people like Andrew at Heller's School at Brandeis University are studying this. It's something we should keep track of because eventually someone should pay the price for the opioid crisis. We just need to find who caused it. And this is just one step further in finding out who caused it. I know a lot of people already believe there's certain families, peoples, and companies that have assisted in causing the opioid crisis. However, I cannot speak to that without court documents stating certain people are guilty of the crime of creating this crisis. But I do believe we are getting closer to that point. Next, we have what's called the Freedom Circuit, and I call it the Freedom Circuit of Public Policy because these are pieces of legislation that assist with freedom generally. Actually, I have a book coming out this year that talks about the most important issues in public policy, what I consider to be the hot button issues for the 2020 election, and how to philosophically think about those issues. Now, what makes my book about hot button issues different than a list of just hot button issues that would be presented before any debate or any election is that these hot button issues relate to how we can make change in our country that reflects the will of the people. Right now, it doesn't matter what we decide in terms of foreign policy, local and state policy, unless certain freedom policy is in place that actually expresses the will of the people. This means how do we get the voice of the people to be expressed through the public policy and legislation that's passed. This is things like campaign finance and equality regulation, some social issues that have to do with equality of opportunity as well. Basically, how do we make sure every single person's voice in America, every American citizen, has an equal weight in deciding what happens in our country? One of the ways we do that is through campaign finance regulation and campaign election law. Here, I thought this was just the most shocking thing to occur in 2020. I wanted to present it sooner, but I wanted to make sure the show was properly structured. I wish we started right on January 1st so I could express this and my concerns sooner, but please note the problem has not been solved. So talk about it. I'm sure your friends don't even know that this issue exists, yet it is extremely important that people are aware of the problem so we can solve it. And that problem has to do with the FEC, or the Federal Election Commission. Now, the Federal Election Commission is an independent governmental organization. It's a watchdog group that actually tracks campaign finance regulations and enforces them. It enforces the laws by actually working with campaigns. Every campaign for political office, local, state, and federal, has to file with the FEC. They get an FEC ID, and then the FEC uses this ID to track all of the donations to the campaign and expenditures of the campaign, along with all political action committees or PACs and super PACs, along with those who do spend money on independent expenditures. So really they're covering the whole scope of money that is spent in public policy elections. That has to do with literally being elected to office or working towards passing legislation. That's why I include more than just campaigns in that description. So the FEC creates and enforces rules regarding election process and procedure, campaign finance regulation, and more. And specifically, they even create campaign donation thresholds, audit campaigns, and they distribute public financing for elections, which means if you elect not to raise money for your campaign because you can get a certain number of signatures saying that people are going to vote for you, you can elect to have public campaign finance in certain states. That means the government will give you a certain amount of money to spend on a campaign, so you don't have to take the chance of being corrupted by certain donations. You can just use public financing to finance your campaign. The FEC has to decide how to disperse that money to you and when to disperse it to you. However, right now the FEC is not able to do almost any of those functions that I just listed because this board supposed to be made up of 6 members, currently only has 3 active members on the board. And the reason is each member serves a 6-year term. Every few years, a certain number of these commissioners go up for reappointment, or a new one could be appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. However, since 2013, no new appointees have been confirmed by the Senate. 2 were appointed and confirmed in October 2013, but none since. That means every single current commissioner on the board, there are only 3, there needs to be at least 4 to meet a quorum to vote, are all holdover commissioners, meaning they have served the full length of their 6-year term and are now held over. They are awaiting appointment of new commissioners before they relinquish their duties so that there's at least somebody on the board. However, there are only 3. And like I said, a quorum requires 4. That means no vote can be taken by the commission to do things like distributing public finance or giving the citizens certain answers to questions about campaign finance regulation, and all of this happened going into the 2020 election cycle. If there was one year that I wanted the FEC to be in place and actively completing its job, it would be going into one of the most important elections in history, And unfortunately, the FEC is no longer functioning as a governing body. There are still many employees that work for the FEC that do continue to audit campaigns, but the more high-level, important decision-making when it comes to campaign finance regulation rules and interpreting the law, the FEC is unable to complete those functions because they are carried out by the commissioner, by the board. So why are we bringing this up now? Only a few days ago, the FEC actually, lobbyists and lawyers who work with FEC regulation, campaign finance law, wrote a letter to the President of the United States, and we actually have this letter here, stating that the FEC needs the help of the President and the Senate. We need to work together and get the FEC back up and working now, so that if there are problems in campaigns in this upcoming election cycle, someone can properly deal with the issue. So the FEC, it says here in the letter, is comprised of 6 members, but now there are only 3, all of whom are holdover members. It takes a quorum of at least 4 commissioners to approve actions by the commission. This is an untenable situation. We urge you to work together and immediately identify, nominate, and confirm a full slate of qualified individuals to serve as commissioners of the FEC. Now, currently, the chairwoman of the FEC, Caroline Hunter, is a Republican representative. There's also 1 Democratic representative on the board and 1 independent commissioner on the board. The commission has to be made up of equal numbers of the major parties. That means there cannot be more of 3 commissioners on this 6-person board that are either Republicans or Democrats. It just so happens that usually there are not even 3 of each party because independents, libertarians, Green Party representatives often make it onto the commission. This is a nonpartisan board. You can have a partisan affiliation, but generally speaking, this independent watchdog group is supposed to make nonpartisan decisions by requiring a quorum of at least 4 people, and only 3 people can be in the same party affiliation, which means eventually the answer that we come to in the FEC is going to be nonpartisan, or at least as nonpartisan as you could hope for in a governing body. Now, this is not the only letter that was sent to the president. First, if you were to read the whole letter, which is linked in the bio, it's a pretty urgent sounding letter. It's like, we need to fix this right now by some very important lobbyist. But another letter was sent as well in December 2019 that the news just didn't pick up on. It was from the old chairwoman of the FEC. She wrote this letter stating the state of the Federal Election Commission, which happens at the end of every single year because chairpeople of the FEC only serve 1-year terms. So at the end of their term, they read a letter stating the state of the FEC is such. Well, this letter was pretty important in the way it was framed. First, I think it was a bit too partisan of a letter. You can read the whole thing and find out for yourself. It even says in the intro, which we're going to read, but it restates this same problem, that there's a lot of problems right now with the FEC. They're not being solved. We need to urgently solve the problem. I do want to point out, the problem created by the FEC not having enough commissioners on the board is not a President Donald Trump problem. This problem has gone on since 2013. That means for President Barack Obama's entire last term and President Donald Trump's first 3 years, almost 4 years in office, we have not had any new commissioners appointed to one of the most important governing bodies in the United States. So that means the Senate and President are unable to work together or are not properly prioritizing making sure there are new commissioners on the board. So let's read the intro paragraph of this new FEC letter from the old chairwoman of the FEC. She says that 2019 has been a tough year for the Federal Election Commission. We lost the first month to a government shutdown. News cycles so fast, I almost forgot that happened. We've spent the last 4 months without enough commissioners to do our most important work. And the 7 months in between were burdened by the ideological obstruction that has plagued the commission since 2018. And this ideological plague that was talked about by the old chairwoman of the FEC has to do with the Russian investigation into whether or not Russia actually affected our election and how the commissioners handled investigating that matter. I definitely recommend reading more into this letter, which is linked in the bio, but essentially based on partisan lines, different investigatory matters were either not performed or after they were performed, resolutions and actions that could reprimand wrongdoers were then shut down by certain members of a certain party affiliation. I definitely recommend you reading into what happened on the board, whether or not you think that is the FEC's function, whether or not they're being too political, and how we can go about reestablishing the FEC as an independent watchdog group. So, now we're moving on to foreign policy. Foreign policy, this is just wild. I always state that if there's one form of public policy that I do not want to review, I do not want to analyze, because I even doubt my own understanding of foreign policy many times because it's just so complex. Who has the capacity to know everything about every governing system in the world? I have trouble just understanding what's going on more complex matters of American politics. Like just the other day, I was asked a deep legal question about what happens during Supreme Court oral arguments while the Supreme Court's Chief Justice is overseeing the impeachment hearing. And I was like, oh my gosh, this question probably hasn't been brought up since the authoring of the Jefferson's Manual. I went to my bookshelf, had to pull down the Jefferson's Manual, look through it to find an answer, tap into some Politico articles to try to find an answer. Like, imagine having that depth of knowledge about every major country's governing system to help analyze foreign policy. Not me, but I do my specified research to analyze topics I'm tasked with, one of which has to do with Russian President Vladmir Putin and his government stepping down after he made an announcement to create an agenda that would weaken his own power as the president of Russia, or the Russian Federation. Hold on one second. We're going to grab a drink, then we'll analyze the rest of this. I was thinking to myself, man, this is going to be such a short show. Sure enough, it is not. Alright. So, the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin. A lot of people think they know a lot about it. Unfortunately, they do not, which really creates some real unreadable, untruthful political stories like this one by Axios, which I just thought was off the wall. I don't even know how it made it past an editor. Putin aims to join world leaders for life. Russian President Vladimir Putin has given the clearest signal yet of how he plans to navigate term limits and join China's Xi Jinping as a possible leader for life. This entire paragraph, this entire article, written in a foreign policy section of a major news outlet, should be an op-ed. It literally should be an opinion piece. Nothing about what happened is clear. Public policy analysts have no idea what Putin's plan is for the future. And Putin's aim to join the world leaders for life is almost counterintuitive to the public policy decisions he is currently making. So what did the Russian government do? Well, much of the Russian government stepped down. It would be about the equivalent of everyone on Donald Trump's cabinet stepping down because of a decision President Donald Trump made, but in Russia. After Russian President Vladimir Putin released an agenda of policy proposals that would weaken his own power in office, so the president's power, or Vladimir Putin's power, and redistribute that power to the prime minister and parliament. And in Russia, it's actually quite controversial why the president has so much power compared to the prime minister and the parliament. They've been discussing redistributing the power since, I believe, 1999. So Vladimir Putin put forth an agenda that would help redistribute his power to parliament and the prime minister of Russia. Now, Vladimir Putin, he's currently serving his second consecutive term as president of the Russian Federation, but his fourth total term. So a second set of non-consecutive two-term presidencies. Very complex. Anyways, the Russian president can only serve 2 consecutive 6-year terms, just like an American president can only serve 2 consecutive 4-year terms. However, nothing in the Russian Federation's constitution states that a president is limited in the number of terms he can serve. So a president could serve 2 consecutive 6-year terms, take an entire term off, an entire 6 years off, and then serve another consecutive 2 terms as their president and continue to do that. I believe Russia has had 3 presidents who have served 4 terms before, Vladimir Putin being the 3rd person to do so. Now, Vladimir Putin also served as the nation's prime minister, which is where people started to get this idea that he is like a possible dictator for life, is that he's been prime minister and president basically his whole life. But believe it or not, he was only the nation's prime minister for about a year. I believe he stepped in to take the place of a prime minister temporarily. But before that, he was the head of a Russian political party, a lieutenant colonel in a Russian intelligence agency, and a director of a Russian college. So he's worked his way up the ladder doing pretty normal jobs. That would be the equivalent of like serving in the military, then when you get out of the military, working for a local university, eventually getting involved in your state or federal political party of your choice, and eventually being appointed to a political position and then running for office. I'd say the same like breakdown of resume is similar to any other president that's made it in America. But there is speculation as to why Putin would restrict and limit his own power in furtherance of future power. And the controversy really has to do with, a ton of people resigned. This is really an unprecedented resignation from office. So it must be really important what happened. And it must play into the speculation that he is a dictator anyways. So the speculation has to do with the fact that after Vladimir Putin finishes up his consecutive term, which I believe ends in 2024, don't quote me on that, what will happen is he'll have the option to go back and serve as prime minister or run for office in parliament and have equivalent power to the power he had as president. Is this true? Literally nobody knows. If anything, opposite of the clearest signal yet, as stated by Axios, this makes the signal even less clear as to what Vladimir Putin's going to do in the future, because now so many options would be opened for how he could serve out the rest of his time. He's a fairly young man for leaving his 4th term as president, but his approval rating is extremely high in Russia, and it only makes sense that he would continue to serve in public service and run for office again. It'd be interesting to see someone who was the president of the United States then go run for like Senate or Congress and be a part of like their equivalent of the parliament, or run for prime minister, which there's not really an equivalent for prime minister, I guess Speaker of the House in America. It would be interesting to see that happen. It would be interesting to see that happen just in Russia as an example of how things go down. So I think it's worth watching. It is an important political story, but I do think all of the news media that has currently been published is just overblown. Like they have no idea what they're talking about in terms of foreign policy, especially this Axios article. So from a nonpartisan point of view, it's worth watching what Vladimir Putin does 4 years from now. It is interesting his whole government stepped down. We need to wait for more information. All right. I had to take a little break there for a deep dive. Now, the deep dives are going to be more public policy oriented. How do we go about analyzing public policy in just a few moments that give you a jumping off point to do more research if this is an area that you are passionate about and it gives you the knowledge you need to go out and make a difference as a citizen lobbyist or just an active voter, active participant in our government system to make a difference in this area of public policy. We're going to start with Big Pharma today. It's one of the more complex areas of legislation, but I think I've really compressed the knowledge to make it easy to understand. So why is this relevant? Why is it newsworthy? Well, President Donald Trump made it a point during his campaign to call out pharmaceutical companies about the higher than usual prices they charge for American-made drugs or American drugs that Americans consume, not always even made in America. These higher than usual pharmaceutical prices higher than usual is a bit of an understatement. Pharmaceutical companies, often based in America, invent and produce drugs and then sell those drugs internationally. Makes sense, they do need to mark up the prices because the cost to make drugs and then get them passed by the FDA to be able to sell them in America is pretty high. The extreme cost, which is usually the excuse used to say, no, pharmaceuticals aren't charging too much money. They need to charge that money to make up their costs because of the extreme cost to get drugs developed in America. Well, in 2018, Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health did a study and determined the median cost of clinical trials used to support the FDA was $19 million. That means once a drug was invented, it cost about another $19 million in clinical trials just to get a drug approved by the FDA so it can be sold in America. This doesn't count the potentially hundreds of scientists that were employed, many years it took to research and develop the drug that is then clinically tested for FDA approval, lab costs, cost of patenting the drugs, etc. So yeah, it does cost millions and millions and millions and millions, if not billions of dollars to invent certain drugs. But the prices that are being charged for Americans to utilize and take these drugs is so significantly disproportionate to other nations that it is unacceptable on an international trade level. This is a nonpartisan opinion. Both Democrats and Republicans agree that the prices being charged to Americans is nearly fraudulent. And it's so high, in fact, that let's take a look at one of these articles. This is a bit of an older article from the beginning of 2018, but I just thought the price distinction over a relatively common drug was so significant that I wanted to show it to you. The article's written by a blogger talking about insulin. And in America, she was being charged for a 10 milliliter bottle of insulin $450. That same bottle was being sold just north of the border, a few miles away, for $21. This has nothing to do with the insurance prices. It would still cost this person $3,000 a month for insulin, and only about $100 or so for insulin in Canada. These prices are charged on different markets. These prices, the distinction of prices in different markets, has nothing to do with the quality of the drug, has nothing to do with marketing, has almost nothing to do with government regulation. All it has to do with is pharmaceutical companies choosing to utilize the richer market of America to charge higher prices because there are no regulations to stop them from doing that. This is often due to the fact that pharmaceutical companies out-lobby every single industry in America to make sure regulations are not put in place to limit their ability to charge such high prices. In fact, the second most lobbied group that lobbies the most is insurance companies. They spend hundreds of millions and billions of dollars on lobbying. Twice that number is how much pharmaceutical companies spend to make sure that regulations are not put in place to allow for fair pricing of pharmaceutical drugs in America. These costs are just so extreme in America that both Democrats and Republicans have put forth bills, including President Donald Trump and Senator Bernie Sanders, to help index these prices or to make sure that the prices charged to Americans is the same or lower than what is charged in other nations internationally. An intelligent consumer, they would compare prices and realize it's cheaper right now just to fly to Canada and buy certain drugs than to actually purchase them in America. But the FDA and lobbyists have gone even further and made it illegal, have banned actually taking drugs from other countries for personal use. So right now we're in a position where both parties have proposed legislation to reduce pharmaceutical products' cost to Americans. They have each been out-lobbied by billions of dollars being spent to prevent these regulations. So Americans, as intelligent consumers, have attempted to buy their personal use drugs from other countries. There's something like 19 million Americans right now are purchasing drugs from overseas illegally. It used to be legal, but the FDA and lobbyists have stepped in and banned the process of purchasing personal use drugs from other countries. Now, why would the FDA do this? There must be some scientific reason behind it. Well, let's take a look at what the FDA says. Go to the FDA website. One of the most asked questions is it legal for me to personally import drugs? Well, this is just one of the most shocking things I've read on a government website ever. It says in most circumstances, it is illegal for individuals to import drugs into the United States for personal use. This is because drugs from other countries that are available for purchase by individuals often have not been approved by FDA for use and sale in the United States. For example, this is where it gets crazy. If a drug is approved by Health Canada, which the FDA claims to be its counterpart in Canada, which have almost the same regulations and requirements as the FDA in America, but has not been approved by the FDA, it is an unapproved drug in the United States and therefore illegal to import. So the FDA is like, look, even if a drug like insulin is approved by Health Canada, our counterpart with the same regulations for quality, efficiency, health in Canada, it's still illegal in America. Why? Well, the FDA has a policy explaining that it typically does not object to certain imports, so here's some exceptions for you. The exceptions include the drug is used for a serious condition, which there is no effective treatment for in the United States, so virtually no drug. Even the few drugs that have been attempted to slip over the border because of this first exception were recently banned in a Supreme Court case that said cancer patients who wanted a unique cancer treatment from Mexico could not go to Mexico to receive treatment. That the court said they would rather have them literally die from lack of treatment in America than receive treatment in Mexico that was not approved by the FDA. Second exception. There is no commercialization or promotion of the drug to U.S. residents. So, there is an exception available. If you want to import a drug into the United States that isn't being commercialized, isn't being sold by the groups that are paying lobbyists to support these regulations. So basically, if a large Fortune 500 pharmaceutical company is not trying to make money by raking Americans over the coals and exploiting them and charging higher prices, sure, you can import drugs from across the border. But if fair prices are being charged because pharmaceutical companies are trying to make money from those drugs, yeah, that's fine. So there'd be no reason to utilize the second exception. And even if you meet one of these two exceptions, the drug is considered not to represent an unreasonable risk. You also have to meet this standard. And the individual importing the drug has to verify in writing that it's for his use, get doctor approval, and even if that's done, you can still only have a 3-month supply of that drug, meaning the cost would increase. You'd have to travel to another country at least 4 times a year to get a year's supply of a drug. So, this is the great length that pharmaceutical companies and lobbyists have gone to make it illegal to get drugs from other countries where they are charging fair prices and instead to charge higher prices here in America. So what's being done public policy-wise? Well, this is where Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders come into the picture. They have both proposed public policy that would make it so that drugs are found, their prices are laid on an index of all international prices, and these pharmaceutical companies would have to charge Americans the lowest international price for drugs. This plan was supposed to be released by the Donald Trump administration. However, it was not. It was actually limited in a certain capacity to only index drugs for Medicare Part B. But eventually it seems as if they would want to make drugs cheaper for all Americans. They're just starting with this first part of the plan. Presidential candidate and Senator Bernie Sanders has proposed a plan that would do the same thing, an international price index for all drugs for all Americans. So we are working towards this goal. However, supposedly, more plans are in the works. However, Politico reported that lobbyists have lobbied heavily against these proposals, and that instead of making headway on reducing drug costs and saving American lives, pharmaceutical companies have increased drug prices in the last 6 months 10.5%. So why are drug prices rising so quickly? That question was answered by lobbyists being interviewed too. That they fear that Trump would ramp up attacks on the industry and that plans would be proposed to combat the idea of charging Americans more for pharmaceutical drugs. So they have to charge more now in fear of losing that profit in the future. Now, I mean, think about how crazy this is. Right in the public eye, pharmaceutical companies are saying, hey, there are plans to make it cheaper for you to buy our products, which we are illegally charging you more money. However, we're going to charge you even more money leading up to the passing of this legislation because we fear losing the profit from charging you too much money. I mean, that's just insane. And they're like openly stating this. Unfortunately, news outlets do not typically pick up these articles. So even when I ask my very involved political friends about issues like this, they don't even know that these statements have been made, that news outlets are publicizing this sort of information. So that's why I wanted to dive deeper into it today. Now, at the end of deep dives, I do want to go into how I would personally shape legislation and write legislation so that if it was written just based off these words, it would at least do the job that Americans want, nonpartisan, both sides of the political aisle want, in terms of fixing pharmaceutical pricing. First, the bill must state that we're giving hospitals, states, and federal governments, and if necessary, military hospitals as well, which fall under the federal government, the ability to bargain with pharmaceutical companies using an ultimatum that would say the drug companies either provide the drugs for the lowest international prices those drugs are currently being offered for, or the hospital, states, and government entities would be able to freely import the drugs from the nation that charges the lowest prices without violating FDA regulations. This would take public policy both being formed on the state and federal level and new additions to FDA regulation that would allow for the exception of this public policy. It could be done fairly easily with only a few clauses in FDA regulation and new bills being proposed in states that are on board with this idea and, of course, the federal government. Now, this is going to be one of many deep dives into Big Pharma, but I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, so for now I'm going to leave it at that. We'll pick a new, more interesting subject to dive into tomorrow. But for now, that's all for episode 1 of Actual Political News on the New Frontier YouTube network. I hope you guys enjoyed. More videos are on the way, and it was nice to meet you all here in my office this morning. Drink up that kombucha and have a good rest of your day.